scraping against concrete was all I could hear. My gloves were thin, torn at the fingertips, and the weight of the toolbox nearly split my arms in half. I was crouched in the driveway, grease streaked across my cheek, when his voice cut through the humid air like a whip. Doing manual labor? That's what you've become? Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us where are you from, and from which city you're watching our videos. And after watching the whole video, don't forget to tell us what would you do in this situation. Be honest. Tell me in the comments below. We read every comment. Let's begin. Every muscle in my back froze. My father's tone wasn't just disapproval, it was contempt, laced with the smug delight of someone who thought they'd caught you at your lowest. I looked up and saw him standing there at the edge of the crowd. Because yes, there was a crowd. My entire extended family, neighbors, a couple of his golf buddies. Apparently, everyone had gathered for a mid-afternoon barbecue in the yard. And there I was, kneeling in the gravel, sleeves rolled up, a wrench in my hand. "You've shamed this family," he boomed, gesturing toward me like I was a bad joke on display. A ripple of laughter spread through the group. I caught my sister's smirk, that slow, knowing curl of her lips that always said she was enjoying every second of my humiliation. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to breathe evenly, not because I didn't care, I cared more than I wanted to admit, but because I'd learned a long time ago that if you gave them a reaction, they'd take it and rip it apart. I set the wrench down slowly, like I had all the time in the world. My palms burned from gripping it too tightly. The summer air was thick with the smell of grilled meat and gasoline, but all I could taste was the bitterness rising in my throat. He stepped closer, making sure everyone could hear. This is what happens when you throw away your degree, when you think you're smarter than the people who raised you. Look at her, elbow deep in grease, living in some rundown apartment, and that's when a deeper, slower voice cut through his rant. "That's enough, Henry." All heads turned. My grandfather, a man who rarely spoke more than a handful of words in any given week, was pushing himself up from his chair. His hands shook slightly from age, but his back was straight, and his gaze locked on my father like a marksman. There was a quiet tension, the kind that freezes even the wind. My father's smug grin faltered, just a fraction. Grandpa stepped forward, each movement deliberate, his walking cane tapping against the patio bricks like a gavel. When he stopped beside me, he didn't look down at my stained shirt or the dirt under my nails. He looked at my father. "If you think this is shame," Grandpa said, his voice slow but razor sharp, "then maybe it's time I tell them what you did 30 years ago." The air seemed to thicken. Conversations died mid-sentence. My aunt's hand froze halfway to her mouth, holding a glass of iced tea. My father's jaw tightened. "Don't start, Dad." But Grandpa wasn't hearing him. He turned to the crowd, his voice gaining strength with every word. "You want to talk about shame? Let's talk about the night you almost destroyed this family. The night you swore me to silence." A murmur swept through the guests. My pulse pounded in my ears. For years, I'd suspected my father was hiding something. But the way his face drained of color told me this wasn't just a petty secret. This was a loaded weapon Grandpa had kept holstered for decades. And now, he was aiming. Grandpa's voice didn't shake. It carried low and deliberate, like he'd been waiting 3 decades to say these words out loud. 30 years ago, Henry," he began, eyes locked on my father, "you stood in this very yard and pretended to be the golden son. But that night, you almost ruined everything your mother and I worked for." People shifted in their chairs. Even the kids stopped fidgeting. My father's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles turned white. "Dad, quiet." The single word hit harder than a slap. Grandpa leaned slightly on his cane, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "It was the summer of '94. Your father," he jabbed the air toward my dad, "was entrusted with $30,000. Not his money, mind you. Company funds. Money that didn't belong to him. And do you know what he did?" No one breathed. "He gambled it away." A collective gasp rose from the group. My aunt's face went pale. One of my father's friends nearly choked on his drink. Grandpa continued, his words slicing through the thick silence. "He didn't just lose it. He lied to everyone. He told his mother he'd been robbed. He told me it was an investment gone bad. He begged me not to call the police because it would destroy the family name." He turned to face my father fully. "You remember that night, Henry?" You remember me selling my own truck, draining my savings, just so you wouldn't go to prison? The air was electric now, heavy with the weight of truth. My father's lips tightened, but his eyes darted toward the guests like he was calculating how bad this was. I stood there, frozen, my hands still smeared with grease, my heartbeat slamming in my chest. For so many years, he'd stood above me, judging me, belittling me, and all along, he'd been hiding this. Grandpa wasn't finished. You call her shameful for working with her hands? She's earning an honest living. She's not lying, cheating, or stealing. She's not dragging our name through the mud and letting her father take the fall. The words felt like fire in the air. My sister's smirk had vanished. She looked between Grandpa and Dad, like she didn't recognize either of them. My father took a step forward, voice low but sharp. You're dredging up ancient history to protect her? She's not a victim, Dad. She's a disappointment. Grandpa's cane slammed against the ground, the sound echoing through the yard. The only disappointment here is a man who never took responsibility for the damage he caused. His eyes softened when he turned to me. And you don't owe anyone here an ounce of shame. My throat tightened. I wanted to speak, to thank him, but the lump in my chest was too heavy. Around us, whispers spread like wildfire. I could feel the shift happening. The way people were looking at me differently now, and at him, with suspicion, with judgment. And deep inside, beneath the shock and the humiliation, something sharp began to take root. It wasn't just relief, it was resolve. Because for the first time, I realized my father's power over me had just cracked. And I was going to shatter it completely. I stood there in the gravel, the taste of iron in my mouth, my gloves dangling from my fingers. The murmur of voices swelled around me, a low current of disbelief and curiosity, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. For years, my father had orchestrated these little performances, moments where he could pull the spotlight, point it squarely at me, and make sure everyone saw the version of me he wanted them to see, lazy, directionless, pathetic, the girl who wasted her degree and embarrassed the family. But now, that script had been ripped clean in half. I glanced at my sister. She was pale, her hands gripping her glass so tight the condensation had made a perfect ring around her thumb. My mother sat rigid in her chair, jaw clenched, not daring to interrupt Grandpa's rare fury. Even his golf buddies, the ones who always laughed at Dad's cheap little jokes about me, were silent, staring at him like they were seeing the man for the first time. And him? My father's composure was cracking. I could see it in the slight tremor in his jaw, the way his tongue darted out to wet his lips before he spoke. He tried to laugh it off, a short, sharp sound. This is ridiculous. 30 years ago, I was a kid. Everyone makes mistakes. Grandpa didn't flinch. A kid? His voice was ice. You were 24 years old. You were married. You had a child on the way. His gaze flicked to me for just a second, enough to make my chest constrict. And instead of preparing for her future, you were sneaking out at night, handing over other people's money to strangers across a blackjack table. A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd. My aunt set down her glass so hard it clinked against the table. Dad's eyes darted toward me then, sharp and calculating, like I was suddenly a threat. And for the first time in my life, I liked that. I felt the weight of everyone's stares shift in my direction, and I knew this was my moment. The first moment I had ever had in this family where I could decide how the story would be told. I stepped forward, wiping my hands on the rag stuffed in my pocket. So, let me get this straight, I said, keeping my voice calm, steady, almost casual. You've spent my entire life telling me I'm a failure because I don't live up to your standards. And all this time, your standard was not getting caught? A few chuckles escaped from the group, quick and awkward, like people weren't sure if it was safe to laugh. My father's eyes narrowed. Watch your mouth! But something in me had shifted, and I couldn't stop. No, I think I've watched it long enough. I've watched it when you cut me down at family dinners. I've watched it when you made jokes about my odd jobs, like they were something to be ashamed of. And I've watched it while you've conveniently left out the part where you nearly destroyed Grandpa's business. His face darkened, the veins in his temple standing out. You think you're clever now, do you? Riding on his protection? I tilted my head, feigning thoughtfulness. Number. I think I'm just tired of being quiet. Grandpa laid a hand on my shoulder. Steady, solid. You don't need to explain yourself to him. He's had 30 years to fix his reputation. You've had 30 seconds to show more courage than he ever has. That line landed. I could feel it in the way the air changed. People weren't just looking at me differently now. They were looking at him like they finally saw the cracks. He tried one last jab. Well, if you think working with your hands is so noble, maybe you should keep doing it while the rest of us handle real success. I smiled then. Not the nervous, tight smile I usually wore when he took shots at me, but something slower, sharper. Oh, don't worry, Dad. I plan on working with my hands for a while longer. Just not the way you think. Because what he didn't know, what no one here knew, was that I had something of my own tucked away. Something that could take that crack in his reputation and split it wide open. And now that the first blow had landed, I wasn't going to stop until the whole facade came crashing down. The crowd eventually began to scatter, but the damage was done. Conversations stayed hushed. Glances kept darting toward my father like they were replaying every interaction they'd ever had with him. I didn't stick around to watch him try to salvage his image. I slipped out through the side gate, the heat from the driveway rising up against my legs, my boots crunching over gravel as I headed toward my truck. My gloves were still balled in my pocket, my palms sweating from more than just the weather. The humiliation I'd carried for years had shifted into something heavier and sharper. It was no longer about surviving his constant criticism, it was about ending it, and I already had the first thread to pull. 3 months ago, I'd been cleaning out an old storage unit I'd rented when I first moved out. Buried in one of the boxes marked kitchen stuff was a battered manila envelope with my father's handwriting on it. At first, I thought it was some old tax paperwork he'd tossed in my stuff by accident, but when I opened it, my stomach dropped. It wasn't just tax forms. It was letters, receipts, a handful of legal notices, all with the same law firm's name printed across the top, all dated between 1994 and 1996. And they weren't for my father. They were for a man named Ethan Carter. The name meant nothing to me at first, until I saw one of the notices listing aliases. My father's name was printed there. It hit me like a punch. Back when Grandpa bailed him out, my father hadn't just been gambling. He'd been operating under a fake identity. There was a whole other layer to the story Grandpa told today, one my father clearly thought was buried forever. The thing was, I'd already done some digging. A quiet afternoon at the county records office, a few polite questions to the right clerk, and I'd discovered something else. Ethan Carter had been involved in a property deal that fell apart in a way that looked very familiar. Money gone, promises broken, and the last document in that envelope, a letter from the state's Department of Justice marked case closed, evidence insufficient. It was more than enough to make him sweat if it ever saw daylight. As I drove away from the house, I could still hear my grandfather's voice in my head. You don't owe anyone here an ounce of shame. Maybe not, but I could give someone else a healthy serving of it. I started with the obvious, a call to Maggie, an old family acquaintance who'd worked in real estate for decades and had no love for my father. She answered on the second ring. Thought you swore you'd never call me again, she said, voice dry but tinged with curiosity. I changed my mind, I replied. I need everything you can find on a property deal from 1995, the name Ethan Carter. There was a pause. That's oddly specific. It's worth your while, I said. Trust me. By the time I got home that night, she'd already texted me a single sentence. You're not going to believe who else was involved. And when I opened the file she'd attached, I felt the first real smile of the day tug at my mouth. Because not only was my father tied to the deal, so was one of his closest friends. The same friend who was standing in that yard today, laughing when my father called me a shame to the family. Now it wasn't just revenge, it was strategy. The next week was a blur of late-night calls, quiet meetings, and a kind of focus I hadn't felt in years. Every piece of evidence Maggie sent over fit perfectly into the puzzle I was building. Old contracts, sworn statements, bank transfers that looked clean at first glance, but carried the stink of backroom. Deals. The picture was damning. And the more I dug, the more I realized how carefully my father had managed to craft his respectable businessman persona. It was a mask he wore so well that people never thought to look underneath. But now, I had enough to rip it off in one clean motion. The timing was everything. My opportunity came faster than I expected. My cousin's engagement party was set for Saturday evening, a sprawling outdoor affair in the same backyard where my father had humiliated me just a week earlier. Invitations had gone out months ago. My father was set to give a family toast after dinner, something he loved because it put him squarely at the center of attention. Perfect. I arrived late, deliberately. I didn't want idle chit-chat. I wanted to walk in at the right moment. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the yard was already buzzing. Strings of warm lights hung over tables, people laughed over plates of food, and the hum of conversation was punctuated by bursts of music from the rented speakers. I slipped in through the side gate again, just as my father stepped up to the microphone. He looked perfectly at ease, drink in hand, smile polished for the crowd. Family, he began, voice smooth, is about holding each other to a standard, about protecting our name, our legacy. I stepped forward. Loud enough to cut through his sentence, I said, "Is that what you call what you did in '94, Dad?" The mic caught it. The speakers carried it. Conversation stopped like someone had hit pause. He blinked, the smile flickering. "This isn't the time. No, I think it's exactly the time." My voice didn't shake. I walked up beside him, my boots crunching against the patio. "Last week, Grandpa reminded everyone about the $30,000 you gambled away. But he didn't mention the rest, did he?" A ripple of unease went through the crowd. My grandfather, seated at the front table, watched me with the same steady expression he'd had last week, not interfering, but not looking away either. I pulled a folded document from my bag and laid it on the table in front of the mic. "This is the state record of a failed property deal. Ethan Carter was the name on the contract. And here's the list of aliases the DOJ has on file." I tapped the paper. "Funny thing, Dad, your name is right here." The friend who'd been laughing the loudest at my expense last week shifted in his chair. "You should be careful." "Oh, you're in it too," I said without missing a beat. I turned the second page toward the crowd. "Co-signed by you. 2 men promising land to investors that never materialized. Money went missing. No charges, thanks to insufficient evidence." I looked at my father. "Guess Grandpa bailed you out twice." The silence was suffocating. My mother's eyes were wide. My sister's face was ghostly. People weren't just looking at him differently now. They were looking at him like he was radioactive. He grabbed the mic, voice low and furious. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Really?" I took the mic back, my voice steady. "Because I've got every document, every bank transfer, every letter. I've got statements from 2 people who were there that year, and if anyone here wants copies, I'll be happy to email them tonight." Someone in the back actually clapped, one sharp, startling sound. And it broke the tension just enough for whispers to explode around the yard. I didn't look at him as I stepped back. "You wanted to call me a shame to this family? Fine. But now they know exactly what kind of man gets to decide that." Grandpa rose slowly from his chair and walked over. He didn't speak to me right away, just placed his hand on my shoulder, the same way he had last week. Then he turned to the crowd. "I think we've heard enough speeches for one night," he said simply. "Let's enjoy the party." And just like that, the center of attention shifted, away from my father, away from his carefully guarded image. The conversations that started back up weren't about the engagement anymore. They were about him. By the time I left, I didn't need to say another word. The damage was permanent, and I hadn't even released the documents yet. I slid behind the wheel of my truck, the warm hum of the party fading behind me. For the first time in years, I felt light. Not because I'd embarrassed him. That was just a side effect. No, it was because I'd taken back the power he'd stolen from me, piece by piece, over